Hello and welcome to the Trinity Forum. My name is BJ Owens. I'm the Dean of Trinity Cathedral in Cleveland, Ohio. And we are fortunate to be joined for the first time, once again, depending on how we want to read this, by Polly Bloom. We welcomed Polly just a few weeks ago to be a part of a Trinity Forum to talk about her master's thesis on Trinity Cathedral, on the furnishings and on the architect, which told a lot of the story of how this cathedral came to be and some of the choices that went into it, that taught us everything from the architect Charles Schweinfurth's vision, how it fit into Cleveland culture and architecture at the time, right down to how to properly care for the wooden pews in the choir. So there's a lot of exciting things for everyone who's interested in history and architecture and Cleveland and Trinity Cathedral itself. She joined us for a forum a number of weeks ago, but for those of you who watched, the internet was not kind to us that day, and it simply didn't work out. So Polly is back, and we welcome you back. Polly, I want to start by introducing you. Polly is, we're discussing her thesis. I'll give you the title, which is Cleveland's Trinity Cathedral, a condition survey and history of the interior architectural decoration by Charles F. Schweinfurth, architect. Polly holds an MA in historic preservation from Ursuline College, and it was for that program that this thesis was created. She has an MBA from the University of Chicago, a BA in journalism, and a fine arts degree BA in journalism and fine arts from Creighton University. She lives in Silver Lake with her husband, Paul, and their two college-age sons, Zachary and Matthew. She's currently working for Prospectus Architecture on business development and historic preservation projects. And Polly, we welcome you back to the Trinity Forum, and we're really excited to have you back once again. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, before we get into the heart of your thesis and your work, which was, for me, so much fun to read as someone who is interested, I love the history. I love looking back at the story this place tells and how it relates to this wonderful city, but also a story of the architecture and the architect and his vision. But I also love learning about how we understood ourselves as a cathedral and how the bishop and the bishops of the day saw what a cathedral in an American city like Cleveland could mean and be like. And, you know, it said something to me about a wider vision than this year or next year or even this generation or that generation. And so I want you open with a quote from a quotation from Bishop William Croswell Doane, who is the Bishop of Albany, New York. He says, we want in America to do everything today and to finish instantly whatever we begin. The result is poor churches, badly built, cheaply furnished inside and out with stucco and staining. The great churches of the world are the growth of centuries sometimes. And the man who builds a 10th part of a church well leaves a truer and better monument than he who builds at all. That is a beautiful statement. And I will say I have been in some wonderful stucco and staining churches where the spirit of the place is alive and wonderful. And I've been in some mighty cathedrals that were cold as anything. And I think the point is, yes, you have the architecture to look at, and that's a great blessing of Trinity. But this idea that we only build a 10th part of the church that we're in, and that we pass it along for the next generation to take on because we received it from other generations. So today we're going to talk about what we received from a visionary generation and talk about where we go from there. So Polly, welcome. Tell us a little bit about this project and what drew you to it.
Well, it started, just a good assignment that you have to figure out what you're going to write your thesis about. And optimistically, when I started, I thought I am going to do research on quite a few of the ethnic churches in Cleveland, because Cleveland was home to over 70 different nationalities that built over 12,000 churches. But as I started to get into it, I knew I needed to narrow it down if I was ever going to finish my thesis and get back to work. So Trinity and the architecture and the architect kept on coming up in many things that I was reading. And there was a good amount of research available and different views and information. And so I really started saying Trinity looks like the place to do the research. And then I think at the end of the day, it was really that Trinity is considered the premier sacred space in Cleveland. And it's also considered one of the most spectacular west of New York City at the time that it was built at the turn of the century. And I really feel that beyond the church, the site, the location for the church is symbolic of what Cleveland was at that time. It was the sixth largest city in the nation. And I just was intrigued with the neighborhood. I was intrigued with the architecture and wanting to learn more about what influenced this architecture and looking back at like the English medieval architecture and the revival movement of the Gothic style, because that did influence so many churches in the nation.
Mm-hmm. It's fascinating to me as someone who is putting down roots in Cleveland and learning about it, the history of this city in that time period. And the history of Cleveland in the 19th century, which built up those the immigrant communities that led to combining that with the industry that backed it up to those wonderful, gorgeous sacred spaces that dot the landscape, and some which are standing and some which aren't. There are just some incredible sacred spaces in this city. And of course, the story that we tell, that we learn about through the construction of Trinity, understanding a little about the congregation that existed for 100 years before the cathedral itself was built, but then looking at the neighborhood, the city at that time when this was built was really fascinating. Now, many of us have a bird's eye view of the history of Cleveland, of the neighborhood when this cathedral was built, but maybe someone watching this might be new to this story, or there's sides of it that we might know. Tell us just a little bit about Euclid and 22nd Avenue in 1907. And of course, we all know one does not build a cathedral in a year. So the lead up to this was decades.
It was. And I'm actually going to bring you back to 1810, because that is when the city had 57 residents. And in 1816, Trinity Episcopal Parish had its first formal religious service, which was in a log cabin. The man who put that together was named Phineas Shepherd, and there is actually a plaque in the ladies' chapel there in Trinity in honor of Phineas. So if you look there, you'll now know that he was the one who started Trinity. And he came from Connecticut, and quickly the community started to grow. So by 1830, Cleveland had already started to grow to become a developed village. And by that time, you would have seen early colonial buildings dotting the landscape. And by 1829, Trinity had built a parish and a formal building for themselves. And it was actually also constructed in the Gothic style. And it had a bell tower and 4 Gothic spires, which is pretty impressive, because in 1829, there wasn't a lot of labor-saving machinery. So we're talking about carpenters who have to make the doors, windows, and floors by hand. So as you get up to the 1820s, that was the Church for Trinity, and they were able to stay in that church until 1850s. But this is where you start to talk about the remarkable growth and to start to lay the foundation of understanding what was going on in the neighborhood. because in 1835, the population of Cleveland was only 5,000. By 1860, it was 43,000. By 1870, it was 93,000. And believe it or not, by 1900, we had 382,000 residents.
Mm-hmm.
So it was an amazing growth. I don't think any of us could understand what it was truly like to live in Cleveland at that time, because it was bustling. There was building going on all over. There was extreme wealth being made because we had some of the core industries that were driving the growth in America. We had iron ore, our port was active. We had over 8 rail lines coming into the community at that time. So it was pretty amazing time to be around. And by 1870s, kind of between 1870s and 1900, it had to be fascinating to be here, because at that time is when they started to use iron in construction. So that's when you start to see bigger buildings going up, and the ground floors and the height of the buildings is really becoming amazing. And you can have these wonderful open spaces when you walk in. But it also led to a whole different level of expertise. So, I think if you want to try to imagine it, this went from, in a 70-year period, from 1830 to 1900, from kind of a sleepy town, country town, to a bustling urban society. So that's where I'm going to leave it. So just imagine that it must have been exciting, and it was everything that you could imagine at that time for Cleveland.
Well, we've been through so many periods of boom and bust since then that we can lose sight, and oftentimes it's hard to have an intimate connection to a time period more than a generation or two away. Mm-hmm. And this story reminds us that this space was built at a peak, following decades of really rapid growth. From what you're describing, almost the 19th century version of Silicon Valley speed.
I think so.
as it boomed and boomed. And you can look at what else was happening, what else was being built in the same time period, in the 1900s or the 1910s. You have these other incredible cultural institutions that themselves were not put up the day before, but rather the fruition, the culmination of decades of really, really fast industrial growth.
Yeah, and society was different during that time. The church had a role in the communities to help bring people together. And it also provided moral support. As immigrants would come in, they needed to find jobs. There were tons of jobs available, of course. We were just bustling, but they needed to assimilate into society. And the churches played that role. By 1870, there was actually 10 parishes for the Episcopal Church in Cleveland, which is pretty amazing to think about, the number of churches, because I think they were playing that societal support role.
Right. I wonder, you talk a bit about the role that, let's talk a little bit about what that role was in terms of what churches did to care for their community. One thing that obviously is important, and I've spent a whole lot of time in New York City, and I have a lot of family from there, and have learned that same story of how often immigrant churches served immigrants by being familiar communities of people who speak the same dialect and are often from the same neighborhood in the old country. And we have churches like that all over Cleveland, really remarkable examples of that. But I don't gather that that was entirely Trinity's vibe, though it may have been. Where did Trinity fit in that story, or where did we in particular offer care to a community that was beyond just the Euclid, those who lived here on Euclid Avenue?
Yeah. In the Trinity history book, there's a lot of materials taken from church board notes about Bishop Leonard. And Bishop Leonard, I think it's Trinity 150 years, right? Yeah, get that down.
I of course have my copy right straight from the shelf here. I pulled this down while you were talking.
There's not too many copies around. There's, if you need to, go over to the archives at Cleveland State. But what the...
So exciting, by the way. Can I do a staged reading of it right now?
Yeah. But what's neat,
it really is fascinating when you dig into it. It's about...
Look at chapter 13. I think chapter 13 might be like really where a lot of the story about what was going on at the church is about, if I remember right. But getting back to your question, what was the role of the church? So Bishop Leonard, he really was philosophical and visionary. There was a lot of probably identification of, hey, this is going to be something that goes well beyond me. We need to set it up. These are some of the trustees in his, that he hung around with, and actually he lived on Euclid Avenue. So Bishop Leonard, was surrounded by wealth. But I think these were people who realized that they wanted to leave a legacy. And so Bishop Leonard, if I had to imagine, probably had some good porch discussions sitting in the back beautiful garden and talking about what do we want to make this church be. And he basically identified and preached to the congregants that the reason for the cathedral was very missionary. Yes. It was going to be an extension of Christ. It was going to be a way for the congregants to show that we could support the work of Christ and lay the foundations for development and build that institution of mercy and kindness. And it went beyond that, because I think at the time, with all the immigrants coming in, they needed like a place for learning and fostering even the sick and the orphaned. So it was the whole idea of, we're going to build this cathedral. It's going to be grand. And it's going to be the site of where we're going to do our missionary work. And so he stressed that he wanted to build a cathedral that was meant to serve the masses. It was going to have doors wide open for the religious in gatherings, for people that he said may be churchless and even perhaps creedless, no church to assimilate with. So his... what he envisioned was that the building would be large and spacious and architecturally imposing, so that any passerby would know that it had grand intentions. And some of the things that they built in the church were right at the turn of the 19th century. That's when church design started changing, because some of the early churches, if you go to them, they're kind of pretty much the main areas for the congregation to sit and gather together. And there's not always a lot of extra rooms around the edges, because it was for coming together, worshiping together, and then leaving. But then if you look at what Trinity did, they actually built a church, a cathedral, that was going to do more. So they had to have extra spaces. So they had spaces for Sunday schools where they would teach some of the immigrants about how to assimilate with society, teaching moral code. That's actually mentioned in the 150 years. Behind the church, there was a home for aged women, because at that time, there weren't a lot of support networks. If you were widowed, unfortunately, you did not always have, as a woman, access to the family money. It went to the males in the family. There was spaces for the women's auxiliary, because they played a very pivotal role in being this support. They had charity and relief committees. They ministered to children. I imagine some of the first concepts of daycare, arose in churches. And they actually did even have within Trinity Cathedral workers who called on the needy and sick. So it was some of the first social networks that we had in the United States. And on top of it, it had rec space. So it had gymnasiums so that you would, make sure that you were fit. You had social gathering spaces, because when some of these immigrants came into the United States, I mean, they probably were not, living in the grandest homes. So to gather and to meet your future boyfriend, husband, or your girlfriend, or to have dances, you needed to have a social space where it was appropriate to gather. And morally at that time, you did not just go over to somebody's house and hang out. So it was a good hangout spot. And so they had assembly and game rooms where you could come together. And then finally, they had support for industrial and intellectual knowledge. So they actually had training schools and educational classes. So it goes way beyond what we have for a sacred site today, but it's fascinating.
Well, and we were able to accomplish so much, hold different ideas together. And I hope we still do that. But when I think about, yes, this was the Millionaire's Row. This was one of the wealthiest streets in America, in the sixth largest city in America. So as you mentioned, the carriage procession leading into church was to be seen, right? This was an exciting thing to watch, as the finer, as I believe that in the church we would call it, the bling rolled up and came into church, the fur and the bling. But we also, even from the beginning, there was an important stress on this being a place where, no matter where you are in society, this is your church. This is a place for you. Now, we can talk and should talk about all the ways that kind of discrepancy can actually play out in reality. However, in that context, to be able to hold both together is really important. And when I look at what Bishop Leonard and what other bishops of the day who were envisioning what an American cathedral could look like, that spaciousness that you talk about, I love how Bishop Leonard said it needs to be imposing, in his words. It needs to suggest that this church is putting on airs. We have big ideas about what's going on inside, and I think I hear faithfully those big ideas are the majesty of God, and certainly the Christian story. As you walk in, there's a faithfulness in the art and architecture to the Christian story, yet a profound openness to what is this place for the wider community, that its primary focus is not actually dogmatic, but rather to be a place, one bishop wrote, like these great public institutions, whether it's a library or a concert hall or an art museum, that there is something to offer the whole community that a cathedral can do in a particular way. So a wonderful broad vision, right up to the majesty of the space itself, down to giving people a place of exercise. I haven't found the gym yet. I'm still looking.
I wonder, that's a good point.
Right. They might have had different requirements for a gym at the time. I mean, does that?
Yeah, it probably wasn't, our treadmills. It was probably
like medicine ball and.
Yeah. I was just going to look. I actually have some of the antique weight ball. I was just going to look and see if I could find some and show you.
We'll bring them in on Good Friday or Ash Wednesday.
Yeah, I'm looking around because my mom's an antique hound, and so I keep some things like that.
Well, let's talk about the architecture, and let's talk about Charles Schweinfurth and a little bit about his story. And one thing I loved about reading your thesis, the story of Charles Schweinfurth really inhabiting this space while it was being built. He was an artist and an artisan himself. He actually crafted some of the reredos. to imagine him being in this space and living in it. We as clergy often think about previous priests and rectors and deans and bishops as being an animating force, especially if they were here at a real historical time. But you know, here at Trinity, our worship life is shaped by the particular vision of one artist, and that's Charles Schweinfurth. So help us to get to know this person.
Well, he's pretty fascinating, and you know, here in Cleveland, he really was an amazing architect and left a lot behind. Unfortunately, some great works have been torn down of his. But to give you a little bit of a history on him, he was born in 1856 in Auburn, New York. His father was a wood carver and immigrated from Germany in the 1820s to Auburn. And the most amazing thing about Charles Schweinfurth is he was not formally trained in architecture. It was believed that after he graduated from high school that he started working for Henry Hobson Richardson, who is a very prominent Boston architect and who trained at the, I'm going to try to say this right, it's French, École des Beaux-Arts, which was considered one of the finest schools of architecture at the 19th century. The European schools were really very well considered. We didn't have schools of architecture in the United States until 1870s, where MIT and Cornell were some of the first ones. So anyhow, he was graduating right around the 1870s when not everybody went to architecture school, but he took this position with Hobson for a couple of years. And then we do know that he took a position with the supervising architect of the Treasury and worked also in New York City after that. And he came to Cleveland in a roundabout way. He was asked to build a residence for Sylvester T. Everett. And Sylvester T. Everett was a native of Trumbull County, and he spent 20 years in banking, and then he became a developer of street railways and railroads, mining investments, and he also had ranch properties in Colorado. And believe it or not, that the property that was built for Sylvester Everett was a place where he actually entertained some of the captains of industry. Andrew Carnegie visited him there, J.P. Morgan, and the house actually had 4 presidents visit: Grant, Hayes, McKinley, and Taft.
And I just want to put a note in here and say, if anybody has been to Trinity Wall Street, which is, of course, is a church of great renown, their head of the vestry for a long time was J.P. Morgan.
Oh.
And so to any clergy who are listening to this, how would you like to have J.P. Morgan as your senior warden?
Well, yeah. I mean,
good, very good.
Yeah.
But you also won't get your way.
And the Mathers, I mean, they're right up there, because exactly. Samuel Mather and Rockefeller had kind of a thing going.
This was great. And do you know, Polly, I'm so excited to be, I'm here in the city, and I started to tell my daughter, who has now been in public school, she's a 5th grader, and I started to tell her about this. She said, oh no, I know all about the rivalry between Samuel Mather and Rockefeller. I'm like, well, they're teaching you well.
Well, and make sure you go visit the Rockefeller obelisk in Lakeside Cemetery.
Okay.
And I have to be honest about this. His obelisk is probably 20 feet tall, and it's surrounded by all his family tombstones that are about a foot tall. So he had quite the ego.
But we'll leave that without necessary further comment.
Yeah. So, but getting back to Charles Schweinfurth, just to give you an idea of the number of buildings that he built in the Ohio area, because once he came here, he stayed here until his death. And there was a 2013 Art Neo exhibition on Schweinfurth that identified, and there's a great book if you can find it. There were 56 homes that he built, which 22 of these were on Millionaires Row.
Wow.
But unfortunately, only 10 of those remain standing today. He also designed over 40 commercial or school buildings, and 8 of the buildings and a memorial arch are at Case Western Reserve. So make sure that's a great spot to see some Schweinfurth buildings and enjoy that, what he had. And also go down to Kenyon College in Gambier, Ohio, where he also built 4 buildings. And those buildings have a different flavor. I mean, they're the academic, a little, you know, they don't look like Trinity, but the chapel, the Harkness Chapel at Case Western, I don't want to say it's a mini Trinity, but if you look at the interior of that, and then you look at the interior of your small chapel, that is where you have your lunches and that area, that has a lot of similarities to Harkness Chapel. So, and I know you're going to put some images up, and one of the designs that I think everybody should go see is in the Cuyahoga County Courthouse. There is a magnificent white marble staircase that ends in a massive newel. So that's a public building. You can walk in anytime, and you can see great Schweinfurth detail, the architectural detail that he brings to his buildings. Trinity is, of course, a great example, you know, with all of the wonderful woodwork and the stone carving that's, you know, prevalent. But the courthouse is a great location, public location. And if you ever have a chance to go in the Union Club, that also has some beautiful woodwork of his, you know, examples that you can see today.
Well, let's get to the number we've all been wanting to know. How much did it cost to build this cathedral?
Ah, yes. Well, let me get to those numbers.
Okay.
I need to.
Not that I'm in the market for a cathedral, but you know, let's talk about what it took in 1907 to build a cathedral.
Yeah.
I suspect that will tell us what a treasure it is to be in a space like this.
Yeah, I think it costs less than some nice homes today.
Right.
So when I was doing my research, I was really excited because you guys let me go down to a scary archive file cabinet that was actually William Mather's files. And in it, I found a really good treasurer receipt and building committee report from 1908. And everything else I found was from 1907. And it had it being around $500 or $568,000. But by the grand total by March 1st of 1908 was that it cost $613,644 to build the building, which today is equivalent to 17.2 million, which I think you and I would agree, you can't build that church for 17.
No, you know, there was a cathedral built in North Carolina by the Catholic diocese when I was there. So, and I think they clocked in at something like $45 million.
I think I know exactly which one you're talking about. It was featured in Traditional Building, and it's a beautiful, they did a wonderful job.
Oh my goodness. I'm so glad that these buildings are still being made today. They did a fantastic job. It was surrounded by parking lots like any church today would, which you have to. I understand that, but of course most of our cathedrals are from an era when cities were more dense and walkable, and the idea of a parking lot wouldn't be as required. So that's just what it looks like in the modern era. But that kind of fundraising that it would take to build that, how in the world then? How in the world did we get this cathedral for $17 million and equivalents?
Well, There was actually a good amount of memorials that added to that tally, because subscriptions, which were gifts to finish off the interior, were a key reason that you have all the beautiful carved wood and carved columns, because I think they realized that they needed to get donations to finish the inside. And so they had memorials for what they called it, memorials for specific objects. And in 1908, it totaled $122,863, which is about equivalent to 3.4 million. So
wow,
everything that you're looking at, when you look at the columns that have the carved plaques, and you look at the, anything you look at inside was donated. So it's an amazing amount of, I don't want to say it was arm twisting, but I think there was probably a little bit of influence from Bishop Leonard on the congregants who had the wealth, that you should go ahead and help us make this really be the church that it can be through some of your gifts. So
perhaps on those same back porches you were talking about before?
I think so.
It was fascinating to me to learn about other churches in Cleveland through the lens of Charles Schweinfurth, and to see his influence on taking commissions for Old Stone when they redesigned the interior, working with the chapel on Case's campus. Was that before Trinity or after?
I think it was right before. It was Harkness Chapel.
Harkness Chapel, right.
So the Florence Harkness Chapel was constructed between 1899 and 1900. That's actually, I think it's important to know the story there. It's always good to know, why did somebody decide to build the chapel? And so Florence, it's a memorial to Florence Harkness Severance. Who was the only surviving daughter of Stephen Harkness and the wife of Louis Severance. And so her father was a silent partner and the second largest shareholder with John D. Rockefeller in the founding of Standard Oil. And her husband was also a founding member of the Standard Oil Trust, and he was the first treasurer of Standard Oil. And she and Louis had only been married 1 year when she died in 1895, and she was only in her 30s. You kind of go back and think, was there some sort of a pandemic or, like at that time? And what makes it equally sad is that he lost his first wife, Franny, in 1874, and he was a widower with 4 young children. So, there's a story behind that, of that building. But you asked me the question of where architecturally this sits with Schweinfurth's work. And it's pretty much felt that when Schweinfurth came to Cleveland and he was doing a lot of the house commissions, many of those were the Romanesque design. Very fanciful, full of detail, turrets, just really rich detail in the buildings. And we have some photos that we're going to show you of some of the Schweinfurth buildings, so you can really get a sense of what the homes looked like. Right around the turn of the century, and as you looked at church architecture, that was moving towards the Gothic style. And there was a few architects who really were emphasizing the return to the Gothic style and a very traditional look at it. So right around that time, probably Schweinfurth and some of the church leadership were influenced by two architects. One was called Ralph Adams Cram and Bertram Goodhue. And they, in 1890s, right around that time, had several church commissions that were very prominent in the United States. And they advocated really looking back at some of the European designs of Gothic cathedral and common sense construction, artistic craftsmanship, and they really had that romantic connection back to some of those medieval styles. And then Schweinfurth also himself, in some of the Schweinfurth, the library collection that was donated to Cleveland Public Library, there were many books that were found about Augustus Welby Pugin, who is an architect who lived between 1812 and 1852. And he was an architect who really wanted to revive the medieval Gothic style in a very authentic way. So what you start to see there is the design for Trinity is looking at the kind of very traditional architecture from the sacred buildings that came from the Europeans. And so it's always thought of that Trinity is a very straightforward masonry design. It does not have steel reinforcements. The flying buttresses that are on the side of the church are actually there and necessary to support the high walls of the nave. And so it was his personalized interpretation of the English Gothic, and they call it the Perpendicular period. And if you go in, you'll see that he emphasizes that through the buttresses, the finials, the ribbed wall planes, and the window mullions, which if you stand right in the middle of the sanctuary, I think you get that sense of the verticalness.
Yeah, very much so.
Look outside.
Very much so. Well, when you're in the space, a lot of your work talked about the finishings, the oils needed to care for the wood, the artifacts that are many centuries older than the cathedral itself, because they were donated by people who, out of deep faith and the goodness of their heart, and perhaps the urging of Bishop Leonard on someone's back porch to donate to the cathedral, for which we're grateful. Can you name a piece that, after this process, you just love, you really enjoyed learning about and seeing?
I think I've said this before. I mean, of course, the Reredos is unbelievable, and everybody talks about the Reredos, but I was more intrigued by the Sedilia, which is when you're facing the Reredos, it's off to the left side. And the reason I was fascinated by that is in 1912 and then again in 1939, the Altar Society put together a historical and architectural guide to Trinity Cathedral. And that's also something that's fascinating, because there were a group of ladies who felt it was necessary to identify the origin of many of these memorials. And the reason I think the Sedilia is neat to learn about is the fact that at the time it was considered one of the premier stone carvings in the United States. And it took 6 months for the sculptor to do this work. And you'll notice that there's 4 panels, and they're divided into 15 tile-like squares that are designs of Christian symbolism. And it's a piece that, just like the Reredos, as you go up and you start to look closely at the stone carving, on the left and the right above the angels, there's a shield. One is marked Jesus and one is marked Pax, P-A-X, which is the Latin abbreviation for peace to you. It also has the seal of the American Church and the Diocese of Ohio. So I love the fact that you can stand up near the altar and spend an hour or so and just look around for all the symbolism that was brought into some of the memorials. And it goes on and on. You know, the candelabras are in memory of Bishop Leonard and his wife, and actually have their family crest. It also has the Ohio Diocese crest. And, you know, if somebody is very good at figuring out their saints, you can really have a heyday with all of the different carvings, starting with the altar and then turning around to the candelabra. So it's hard to just say there's one thing I like. I like the whole thing.
I haven't found Saint Bernard yet, but I'm looking.
Well, you know, up in the Reredos, there's people feel like the night is, you know, there's somebody has to just, you know, go look at it, because there's a knight. He's not really a religious figure.
Yes. But
so I think when you talk about Schweinfurth, he's got a good sense of humor, because for somebody to do that very, you know,
to put Arthur next to Jesus,
to put King Arthur in it.
Yeah.
And you know, one thing that I found when I was doing the research, when you guys let me go into that file cabinet for William Mather, I also found a handwritten note from Schweinfurth to Bishop Leonard. And on it, he said, all it was is it said, Bishop Leonard, I hope you like this receiving basin, you know, your good friend Charles, right? Or something like that. But here's the funny thing. You know, when the whole design of the cathedral was started, it was Romanesque, then it turned into Gothic, and the receiving basin was Romanesque. So I think that was just, you know, turning the knife and saying, hey, just so you know, I am going to make this receiving basin Romanesque. You know, I'm not going to give you a Gothic style.
Well, you know, something that we've had to do, because we are live streaming from the cathedral, we've been doing that from the chapel, because it makes a good compact, kind of like a studio in a way.
Oh, yeah.
And we're also trying to observe the fact that we're not gathering in the cathedral because this is the pandemic, and we're acknowledging that in certain seasons we're just not there. And so being in the chapel is a little bit of a secondary space. This past Sunday was All Saints, and we chose to to celebrate and film it from the high altar. Oh. And we rarely celebrated the high altar. We did it a year ago on All Saints when we were still gathered. There are a lot of reasons why we don't do it. You know, at least there are some liturgical changes that have happened since 1910, and we want to be out among the people wherever possible. But last year when we celebrated communion, and those who were able to come forward, now I'll note it's not handicap accessible, which is something that we regrettably is not there. So we do this rarely, but it was really, to me, just a very spiritual experience to be up in that at the high altar, and to have the whole congregation move forward and to gather with us at the rail, and realize that was how we celebrated the Eucharist when the church was built. And I'm thinking about the flexibility of this space. When we filmed this service past Sunday, it actually worked really well. I know Schweinfurth had no intention did not envision us filming the service. That wouldn't have been on the radar. But there is something about this cathedral has something new to teach me every week. And I've been in this building a lot now. And that's one of the I can tell that we're amidst the workings of a great artist, because there is something new that this story of the story that is told every week. And this is where I want to lead to the next question. It threads well into the story of today. So I don't feel like Schweinfurth and Bishop Leonard are telling us a story for all time. This is 1907, here's the story. But rather, this is a canvas and a platform. And it is an intentionally wide and majestic canvas on which we will continue to tell this story.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an evolving story, and it's one that gains from a growing inclusion and welcome that also roots in our tradition. And so
Yeah.
I want to close with this question, which is, we are gifted, we've been gifted with a museum quality work of art filled with museum quality works of art. And we can celebrate that as the community of the cathedral, which is wider than the Sunday congregation. It's you, it's me, it's everybody who loves this place. We have the opportunity to preserve something that is actually unique in the American context, to be a Midwest cathedral, to tell the story of the city in the way that it does, and yet to also be in the midst of a living, breathing, joyful, and suffering city, all at the same time. How do we celebrate this space, but not simply encase it in amber? How do we be a living cathedral in our time, in our city, in our wider community, in our diocese?
Well, I wasn't a member of Trinity when I started this, and so I came to Trinity without any preconceived notions. And as I researched Trinity, what I was most amazed about was the fact that Bishop Leonard's vision and the congregants who built this beautiful building at the corner of 22nd and Euclid. I don't know. I hope that they thought it was going to be around forever and ever. But what was amazing as I looked at what happened with other churches and other congregations was the fact that you stuck it out. And these are, parishioners that came before you. They went through some hard times when people were abandoning the downtown. Right. But the group felt that it was necessary to stay there. They didn't give up. They probably went through some years of very bad blight around the Trinity, and then they turned it around. I mean, they stuck it out. They kept on showing up. They didn't abandon their neighborhood. They didn't abandon the neighbors. In fact, they figured out how to flex and how to help the neighborhood. And now you're on this side and you've got a beautiful neighborhood. You're on the edge of Playhouse Square. You've got Cleveland State and, some wonderful downtown restorations that is making Cleveland an attractive city to come home to.
Yeah.
And so I think if anything, I would say, don't stop what you're doing. Keep that vision and go back to the amazing fact that Bishop Leonard saw that this was a church for all people, and your congregants have kept that close to their hearts and keep on living that way. And they've opened doors to people off the streets who don't have homes. They open their doors to students, when you're in Trinity Commons, there's a stream of students who walk through there every day, and you're impacting them. And Bishop Leonard and Schweinfurth didn't know what they were building that could someday see kids, walking through with headsets on.
Right.
I'm sure it was a surprise. But I guess I would just end saying, don't change, keep that vision. And that's amazing that, 100 and tons of years later, that vision is still alive in your community, and that Trinity can be a symbol for that. That it can be a symbol for longevity. I mean, it's a beautiful building, but more importantly, it's a beautiful building because of what has been able to happen over those 100+ years within the building and within the congregants to be so committed to that. And I'm sure that there's people who walk in the door who don't know the Bishop Leonard story, or, even know that that's what they envisioned, that it was a church for all people, and that it was going to go beyond the people who had relationships and, and that long term, belonged to the church, that it was always going to be open to look for more.
Yeah. Well, thank you for helping describe a church that we can all come home to. And I think telling that story and learning that story allows us to do that and think about 150 years down the road when people will be learning about Bishop Leonard and then the pandemic 100 years ago, past that, and then passing it on to the generation after that. That's one of the great gifts of what we do together. Polly, I'm so grateful to have you as a part of this work and this wider cathedral community. And I'm grateful for the work and the gift that you've given us to help those walls, those statues come alive for us every Sunday when we're here. So blessings and thank you for spending so much time with me here today.
Thanks. It's always fun. So hopefully we'll all get together and do a tour.
Absolutely. We look forward to it.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye now.
Well, I want to thank Polly Bloom for joining us. There is so much to learn about this place, and I'm so grateful for her work. If you'd like to learn about about reading her thesis, get in touch with us. We'd love to get a copy to you. And I give thanks for your time, spending time with us today. We do hope when we're all back together again. Polly and I talked about finding a way to be back in the cathedral and doing some kind of forum in the space itself. She really loves to be there and to show some of the pieces that she's studied. So we'll learn more when we'll have more opportunities to interact with Polly Bloom on down the road. So thanks for being with us.